What if your family's darkest secret wasn't buried in the ground but locked inside a dusty box, hidden so carefully that the authorities swore it should never see daylight again? And what if, by opening one single folder, you woke something that had been waiting, listening for more than half a century? Emily Harper didn't believe in curses, at least not when she walked into the Clay County Historical Archive that evening. She was a researcher, the kind who lived for brittle paper and half-forgotten records. But the archive at night was a different place entirely. The silence pressed in like a physical weight, broken only by the buzz of fluorescent lights and the measured tick of the old brass clock on the wall. Dust floated in pale shafts of light, turning the room into a frozen snow globe of forgotten history. She was sorting through dull mining ledgers when her hand brushed a folder that didn't belong. Its cover was thicker, yellowed in a way that made it stand out. Across the front, stamped in fading red ink, classified, "Do not destroy." The date read 1955. Something about those words made her hesitate. Emily's fingers trembled slightly as she opened it. A stale cloud of dust rushed into her lungs, making her cough. On the first page was a black and white photograph of a woman in her 20s. The image was grainy, yet her eyes were disturbingly sharp, dark, bottomless, alive in a way that made Emily shift uncomfortably in her chair. Beneath the picture, typed neatly, Mary Whitmore. Case #47/55. The next pages sent a slow chill through her. There were interrogation transcripts, psychiatric reports, yellowed newspaper clippings with headlines scratched out in ink. Notes scrawled in the margins, written by a steady but heavy hand, gave the impression that someone important, had pored over this case more than once. One line had been underlined twice. "Preserve forever. Do not destroy." Why preserve a family case file forever? Her eyes skimmed further. Marriage deemed incestuous. Subject unaware of relation to spouse. Another page. Child born with anomalies. Polydactyly, abnormal spinal growth. Emily's throat went dry. She read a psychiatric evaluation that described Mary's breakdown in haunting detail. Patient insists she hears voices of deceased family members. States repeatedly, "The bloodline is cursed. The child is marked." Emily pressed her palms flat on the desk, grounding herself. The air around her suddenly felt denser, harder to breathe. The longer she read, the more oppressive the archive became, as though the room itself disapproved of her curiosity. At the very back of the file, tucked between a torn transcript and a faded photograph, she found a crude, hand-drawn map. It was labeled Harrow's Creek, a forgotten Appalachian mining town. A house had been circled in red, the Whitmore residence. Next to it, in pencil, someone had scribbled, "Surveillance terminated after incident." No details. No final report. Just silence. Emily leaned back, staring again at the photograph of Mary. The woman's eyes seemed different now, less like an image, more like a gaze that crossed the years to settle on her directly. She closed the folder, but the stare didn't leave her. A gust of wind rattled the warped window panes, making them groan. The shadows in the corners seemed to shift, and Emily realized she was alone in the building. Alone except for the photo that refused to stop looking at her. She slipped the folder into her bag. Against every sensible instinct, she knew she had to see Harrow's Creek for herself. Whatever happened in that town 70 years ago had been buried under official silence. But silence never lasts forever. And something told her Mary Whitmore had been waiting for someone exactly like her to open the door again. The drive into the mountains took longer than Emily expected. By the time she left the main highway, the last traces of daylight had already drained from the sky, leaving only a bruised purple horizon. The road narrowed to a cracked ribbon of asphalt, hemmed in by endless walls of pines. Their black silhouettes leaned over her car like watchmen, shutting out the stars. Harrow's Creek wasn't on most maps. Emily only found its name scrawled on the yellowing folder, but her GPS barely recognized it, trying to reroute her back to paved highways again and again. Eventually, the voice of the device gave up entirely, leaving her headlights cutting through the void as she followed the road deeper into the mountains. The farther she drove, the heavier the air felt. Fog crept from the treeline in long, ghostly fingers, twisting around her car. Twice she thought she saw figures standing just beyond the reach of her headlights, only to realize it was nothing more than crooked fence posts or twisted trees. Still, her grip on the steering wheel tightened until her knuckles were white. At last, a battered wooden sign appeared at the roadside. Its letters were faded, the paint almost gone, but she could just make out the words. Welcome to Harrow's Creek. Founded 1893. Someone had nailed an old horseshoe above the sign, upside down, the luck pouring out onto the ground. The town itself felt like it was holding its breath. A scattering of houses slouched along a single main street, their porches sagging, their paint long since surrendered to rot. A few dim lights glowed in windows, but no movement, no laughter, no voices. The only sound was the low hum of cicadas, pulsing in the dark like a warning. Emily parked by what must have been the town's library, a squat brick building with ivy strangling its walls. Inside, the air was cooler, though no less heavy. Behind the desk sat a woman in her 70s, hair tied in a severe bun, her spectacles perched low on her nose. She didn't smile when Emily introduced herself as a researcher. "You'd best not dig too deep here," the woman said, her voice low, the Appalachian accent thick and deliberate. "Some stories are buried for a reason." But Emily pressed, mentioning she was working with county archives. At that, the librarian sighed and, after a long silence, led her to a back room lined with boxes. Dust cloaked everything. "These records should have burned," the woman muttered almost to herself. "But they didn't, and they shouldn't be touched." Emily opened one of the boxes. Inside were church registries, census forms, old-school ledgers. She flipped through until a name stopped her cold. Whitmore, Mary. Then another Whitmore, Stephen. Birth dates, marriage records. The librarian's gaze burned holes into her back as Emily read. "They still whisper about that family," the woman said, almost spitting the words. "House is still standing, though nobody lives there. Not for long, anyway. Kids won't go near it. Say they hear crying at night. Baby crying, but there's no baby. Hasn't been for 70 years. Emily turned, but the librarian had already left the room, leaving her alone with the records and the dust. The silence in the little library was suffocating. Outside, the cicadas went quiet all at once, as if the whole town had paused to listen. Emily closed the ledger and whispered the name under her breath. Mary Whitmore. The air seemed to shift when she spoke it aloud, as though the name itself carried weight in this forgotten place. She didn't yet know where the road was leading, but she could feel it. Harrow's Creek was waiting for her. The more Emily dug through the brittle papers, the more the Whitmore name seemed to multiply like a stain. The marriage license between Mary Whitmore and Stephen Whitmore was filed neatly, as though nothing were unusual. But when Emily traced the family tree scribbled in pencil in the margins of an old census record, her stomach twisted. Samuel Whitmore, the patriarch, had raised Mary after her parents died in a fire. Years later, Stephen, Samuel's only surviving son, returned from military service and took Mary as his wife. Mary had married her own uncle. Some notes suggested an even darker suspicion, that Samuel himself had fathered her, which would mean Stephen was not just her uncle, but possibly her half-brother. The web of blood knotted so tightly it was impossible to tell where family ended and sin began. Emily's fingers brushed over a birth certificate tucked between school rosters. The infant's name was never listed. Only one line stood out in faded type. Male child, congenital deformities. Below, written in fountain pen by a physician. 6 digits on each hand. Abnormal curvature of spine. Subject unusually large for gestational age. She swallowed hard, the silence of the library pressing in on her like a physical force. Other records hinted at whispers that began after the wedding. Crops near the Whitmore property withered without reason. Livestock were found dead, eyes clouded, tongues blackened. Children in town began to fall ill with fevers no doctor could explain. And though no one dared write it outright, the timing was unmistakable. It all began after Mary married Stephen. Emily felt the name Whitmore like a curse rolling off her tongue as she whispered it again. The pages in her hands trembled, though whether from the draft or from her own unease, she couldn't be sure. In Harrow's Creek, family ties weren't just bloodlines. They were chains. And Emily was beginning to wonder if the Whitmores had bound themselves to something older, something darker than kinship. In the dim back room of the Harrow's Creek Library, Emily found something that didn't belong with the census ledgers or church registries. It was an old notebook, its spine cracked, the leather cover warped by years of damp. The first page bore a name written in looping, elegant script. Claudia Brown, teacher, Harrow's Creek School. Emily's pulse quickened. A teacher's diary. First-hand testimony. The entries began innocuously, lessons, attendance notes, the small triumphs and failures of rural children. But the tone shifted abruptly in 1949, the year Stephen Whitmore returned from the war. He came back taller, gaunter than I remembered, Claudia wrote. The boy who left as a soldier has returned a man, with eyes that do not rest. He keeps near Mary Whitmore always. There is a hunger in the way he looks at her. Troubles me. Emily flipped forward. Mary and Stephen have married. The town is whispering. We know they are kin, though the preacher blessed their union without hesitation. Their house sits at the edge of the pines. Since the wedding, the air feels heavy, as if the trees themselves are listening. Another page. Mary is with child. I dream of her often, though I do not wish to. I see her belly swell and hear the faintest sound of a baby crying, though she has not yet delivered. I wake with my pillow damp, not from sweat but from tears I do not remember shedding. Emily swallowed hard and kept reading. Months later, Claudia wrote of the birth. The tone was jagged, frantic. The child, it is wrong. The midwife will not speak of it, but I have seen. 6 fingers on each hand. The whites of its eyes already stained gray, like an old man's. It does not cry as other infants cry. The sounds are too low, too knowing. The diary darkened further with each entry. Neighbors claimed to hear that strange infant wailing in the woods at night, long after Mary had drawn her curtains. Crops failed near the Whitmore land. Dogs refused to go past their gate. And then, the house has burned. The words were underlined twice. Claudia's account was halting, scattered, but the picture was unmistakable. Smoke rising from the Whitmore homestead, flames clawing at the roof. Stephen discovered inside, bound by ropes to the frame of his bed, the fire lapping at his legs. Mary standing in the yard, her hair wild, her nightdress soaked with smoke and sweat, shrieking words no one could understand. But it was the last detail that turned Emily's stomach cold. Though the house burned, many swore they still heard the child, a baby crying, thin and piercing, from within the blaze. Yet when the fire was quenched, no body was found. Emily closed the diary, her hands trembling. The library's silence pressed harder now, every creak of the building a whisper of that impossible sound. A child's cry carried on smoke. The Whitmore's secret wasn't just a matter of bloodlines. It was fire and voices, and a child who should not have lived. And somehow Emily knew it hadn't died in that fire either. The Whitmore house stood at the edge of the tree line like a carcass left to rot, its windows black hollows staring into the forest. The roof sagged in the middle, and vines clung to the siding like veins on pale skin. Emily cut the engine and sat for a moment, her hands still gripping the steering wheel, listening to the tick of cooling metal. The silence outside was complete, heavy, as though even the insects avoided this place. She forced herself to step out. The air was damp with the smell of moss and rust. The porch boards groaned under her weight, and when she pushed the front door, it opened without resistance, as if the house had been expecting her. The first breath inside made her gag. The smell was metallic, sharp, tinged with something unmistakably organic, like dried blood. Dust blanketed everything, yet it wasn't the thick, undisturbed dust of decades. There were drag marks across the floor, as if something heavy had been moved not long ago. Emily's eyes scanned the parlor. Furniture slumped in gray sheets of dust, but on the dining table, in a clear circle amid the filth, were fresh fingerprints. Someone had touched this table recently. The clock on the mantel stood frozen at 3:15, its pendulum still, though Emily thought she heard the faintest tick, like a heart that refused to stop beating. On the wall above the fireplace hung a photograph in a cracked frame. Mary and Stephen Whitmore on their wedding day. Their faces were clear, solemn, but the infant cradled in Mary's arms was nothing more than a smear, the image blurred beyond recognition. Emily leaned closer, too blurred to be a printing error. Someone had deliberately scratched the child's face out of the negative. She moved deeper into the house, each step stirring up the smell of char and rot. In the hallway, symbols had been carved into the plaster. Crude circles intersecting lines, almost like runes. They reminded her of the marks she had seen in the margins of the case files, drawn in ink that bled like blood. The tension in her chest tightened as she climbed the staircase. The second floor groaned beneath her weight. At the end of the hall, a door hung ajar, faintly painted in blue, faded now to ash gray. The nursery. Emily pushed it open. Inside was a child's room, but twisted by time and fire. A crib stood against the wall, its bars blackened, warped by heat. The sheets inside were half-burned, strands of rope tied to the frame as though something, or someone, had once been restrained there. On the dresser, under a film of dust, lay a small object. A necklace of sorts, a crude amulet. A circle of twine bound around a dried plant, brittle petals still clinging to the stem. Emily picked it up, and the air shifted immediately, colder, denser. A sound, faint, high-pitched, fluttered at the edge of hearing. For a second, she thought it was the whine of wind through broken glass. But then it sharpened into something else. A child crying. Emily dropped the amulet back onto the dresser, her pulse pounding in her ears. The room seemed to shrink, the shadows leaning in closer, the burnt crib creaking as if something inside it had shifted. She stumbled backward into the hall, her breath catching, the smell of smoke and metal filling her lungs. The Whitmore house wasn't abandoned. It was waiting. The state psychiatric hospital sat 30 miles from Harrow's Creek, its shell abandoned for decades, ivy swallowing the red brick, windows broken into hollow sockets. But Emily didn't come for the building itself. She came for what the state had tried and failed to bury. Through the county clerk's office, she had managed to obtain access to a stack of medical archives from the 1950s. A junior administrator, too distracted to care, had left her alone with a file box stamped property of the West Virginia State Hospital. Emily's fingers trembled as she pulled out the folder marked Whitmore, Mary, Admission Records, 1956. The notes inside were written in the clinical detachment of doctors. Yet every line oozed dread. Patient, female, age 23, exhibits acute paranoia, repeats delusions. The blood is cursed. The child is marked. Displays violent resistance when infant is removed from her arms. Sedated with morphine. Another entry followed days later. Mary Whitmore suffers recurring hallucinations. Reports hearing voices of deceased family urging her to kill the infant. Frequently scratches words into walls. Stop the bloodline. Requires constant observation. Emily swallowed as she flipped further. Photos were clipped to some reports. Grainy black and white shots of walls scrawled with symbols, the same jagged runes she had seen carved into the Whitmore home. Then came the infant's file. Male child, approximate 3 months. Polydactyly, 6 digits both hands. Abnormally rapid motor development, able to support weight, grip with excessive force. Attendant bitten during feeding, wound severe. Child's cries noted to vary in pitch and frequency, some resembling words. Emily's chest tightened as she read. The handwriting of the doctors grew more frantic with each entry. The language less clinical, more desperate. During brief electrical outage, infant no longer present in crib. Search conducted. Windows barred. No sign of forced exit. Unresolved. And beneath, written in ink so heavy it had bled through the page. The child walked out. Emily's breath caught. She scanned the final pages. Weeks after the disappearance, Mary's condition collapsed entirely. Her body was found in her cell, lifeless, though not in the manner of suicide. Autopsy inconclusive. Severe internal trauma to chest cavity. Organs displaced as though compressed from within. Cause of death undetermined. A final note, and signed, had been slipped into the folder. All staff are instructed not to speak further of the Whitmore case. Records to be sealed indefinitely. The folder ended there. No follow-up. No explanation. Just silence, stamped official and final. Emily stared at the stack of papers, her hands cold, her breath uneven. For the first time since opening the case file in the archive, she considered closing everything and walking away. But the silence in the hospital records wasn't just bureaucratic. It was fearful, the kind of silence people kept when they'd seen something they couldn't explain and never wanted to again. And Emily knew with absolute certainty. If the child had truly walked out, it had walked into the woods of Harrow's Creek. and it had never left. The lead came from a forgotten payroll ledger Emily found in the box of hospital files. Valerie Price, attendant, Ward C. A woman still alive if the records were right. After 2 days of inquiries and dead ends, Emily finally tracked her to a weather-beaten house on the outskirts of Charleston. Valerie was in her 80s now, her frame small and brittle, but her eyes sharp as glass. She listened without interruption as Emily explained who she was and what she had found. At the mention of the Whitmore name, Valerie's lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. "I shouldn't talk about that night," she said finally, her voice low, quivering. "We were told never to speak, but I've carried it in my chest for 70 years. Maybe it's time." Her hands trembled as she poured tea into chipped porcelain cups. The room smelled faintly of mothballs and lavender, but beneath it lingered something metallic, like rust. "I was on night duty when the power went out," Valerie whispered. "Only for a minute, maybe less, but in that minute the world changed. When the lights came back, the crib was empty, the baby gone." Emily leaned forward, heart pounding. "But I saw it," Valerie continued, her voice breaking. "I swear to you I saw it. A shadow, shaped like a child, but darker, denser, as if it was made of smoke. And it wasn't walking, it was being carried. Something unseen held it in the air, cradling it, taking it away." Her eyes glistened, and her fingers fumbled inside a drawer until she pulled out a small object. An amulet, ancient and crude, bound from twine around a flat stone carved with strange intersecting lines. The same symbols Emily had seen in the Whitmore house. "I kept this," Valerie said, pressing it into Emily's palm. "They said it was found in the mother's cell after she died. I think she made it to keep herself safe. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. But listen to me. Listen well." Valerie's voice hardened, her gaze locking on Emily's. "If you ever hear a baby crying where no child should be, don't follow it. Don't listen. Don't stay. Run. Because that's not a baby. That's him." Emily's breath caught as she closed her fingers around the amulet, the stone cold and heavy as if it carried all the years of silence with it. And for the first time, she realized she wasn't chasing a mystery anymore. She was being led. The cemetery lay on the northern edge of Harrow's Creek, where the woods grew wild and the fog never seemed to lift. Emily arrived just before dusk. The sky hung low and bruised, the clouds sinking like a lid over the town. A crooked wooden arch marked the entrance. Harrow's Creek Cemetery, EST 1887. Beyond it, rows of leaning headstones slouched beneath gnarled trees. The caretaker met her near the gate, a wiry man in his 70s with a lantern and a face carved by decades of mountain winters. He eyed her with suspicion at first, but softened when she mentioned the Whitmore name. Not out of kindness, out of wariness. "You really want to see their graves?" he muttered. "Most folks avoid that part." He led her down a narrow dirt path that twisted through the oldest section of the cemetery. The ground here was uneven, as if the earth itself had shifted in its sleep. Stephen Whitmore's grave sat among the oldest stones, nearly swallowed by weeds. A simple iron cross leaned drunkenly over a rusted plaque. Stephen Whitmore, 1922 to 1956. The lettering was half erased by time. Mary's grave was nowhere near his. The caretaker guided her further down, toward the far corner of the grounds where the trees pressed close, blotting out the last scraps of daylight. "They wouldn't bury her near the others," he said. "Said she'd brought sin into town. Buried her out here with suicides and strangers. The marker was plain. A small, cracked stone without even a date. Mary Whitmore carved in shaky letters, as if by hand. But what made Emily's breath catch was the mound of earth a few feet away. No marker. No flowers. Just a small hump in the soil, barely the length of a child's coffin. She turned to the caretaker. His eyes flicked toward the mound and then away, as if looking too long might bring something up. "They brought a bundle here the night of the fire," he said quietly. "Late. No ceremony. No preacher. Government men. Told me to dig and keep my mouth shut. 70 years later, I still don't talk about it much." Emily stepped closer. The air grew colder, sharp enough to sting her lungs. The fog thickened at her feet, swirling like breath. She crouched to examine the mound. The soil looked oddly fresh, darker than the surrounding earth, as if it had been disturbed recently. Then she heard it. Faint at first, so soft she thought it might be the wind whistling through the trees. But no, it was rhythmic, wet, fragile. A baby crying. Emily froze, every muscle locking in place. The caretaker's lantern flickered. The cry grew louder, clearer, bubbling up from beneath the earth. Emily's breath hitched as the mound of soil trembled. Just slightly at first, then more violently, as if something beneath was pushing upward. She stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a root. Her pulse roared in her ears. The caretaker dropped his lantern with a curse, the light swinging wildly across the graves. The mound shifted again, this time unmistakably. A ripple coursed across the soil like something alive was pressing against it from below. Emily didn't think. She ran. Branches clawed at her arms as she fled the cemetery path, heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Behind her, the sound of the crying grew shriller, echoing through the fog like a warning. She didn't look back. Not once. By the time she reached her car, the night had fallen fully. The cemetery behind her was silent again, the fog still, as if nothing had happened. But Emily knew better. Something was still in the ground, and it knew she'd heard it. Emily found Claudia Brown living in a small white house at the edge of town, its porch surrounded by rose bushes gone wild. Claudia was well into her 90s now, but when she opened the door, her eyes were bright, alert, like someone who'd been waiting for this conversation for a very long time. "I wondered when someone would finally come asking," she said, ushering Emily inside. "I'm the last one who remembers what really happened." The house smelled of cedar and old books. On the table lay stacks of photographs and yellowed newspaper clippings, as if Claudia had been curating a private archive all these years. She poured Emily tea, then sat across from her, folding her frail hands. "Samuel Whitmore wasn't just a man with secrets," Claudia began. "He was part of a sect that called themselves Children of Lilith. Older than this town. They believed they could bring power into the world through blood, through incest. They thought a child born that way would have gifts, strength, sight, something inhuman." Emily felt her skin crawl as Claudia spoke. "When that baby was born, things started happening. Children in town began to fall sick. Fevers, internal bleeding. The doctors couldn't explain it. The autopsies were worse, organs crushed from the inside, like an invisible hand had squeezed the life out of them. 7 children died that winter. Everyone knew when it started, the night of the fire." She leaned closer, lowering her voice to a whisper. "Government men came, not just police, people from outside. They held rituals in the cemetery. Old rites, not Christian ones. After that, the deaths stopped. People were told to forget, to never speak the Whitmore name again. Emily stared at her hands, her pulse quickening. "Why me?" she whispered. Claudia's gaze softened. "Because you're one of them. I saw your last name when you came in. Harper. Your grandmother was Anna Whitmore. She left before it all happened, but blood doesn't care about distance. You carry it. And maybe," her voice faltered, "maybe that's why he noticed you." The room seemed to shrink around Emily as the weight of those words settled. The crying at the grave, the amulet, the sense of being led. It all clicked into place like a door closing behind her. She wasn't just uncovering a story. She was part of it. The night she returned to the Whitmore house, the sky was black as coal, the moon hidden behind a lid of storm clouds. Emily parked at the edge of the dirt road and approached on foot. The amulet Valerie had given her clenched tight in her fist. The house loomed ahead, darker than the forest behind it, as if it swallowed light. Inside, the air was colder than she remembered. The smell of metal and smoke hit her the moment she crossed the threshold. Her flashlight beam slid across the hallway and caught the carved symbols on the walls. The same runes she'd seen in the files, only now they seemed sharper, as if freshly cut. Something was waiting. She climbed the staircase slowly, her boots creaking on the warped wood. At the end of the hallway, the nursery door stood wide open, though she was certain she'd left it shut. A faint blue light flickered inside, like cold flame. Emily stepped in. The glowing lines on the walls formed a circle around the crib, symbols pulsing softly like a heartbeat. Her breath came in shallow gasps. She knew the story now. The sex ritual had been meant to bind the spirit of the child to a mother's blood. Samuel Whitmore had intended Mary to be the vessel. But Mary was gone, and the child had chosen someone else. The air thickened. Her flashlight flickered, then died. In the dark, a sound rose from the crib, a wet, uneven breathing, followed by a tiny, high-pitched giggle. Then she felt it. Small, icy fingers brushing her cheek. Emily spun but saw nothing, just the shifting dark. A child's voice, whispering from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Mother!" Her lungs seized. The amulet in her hand burned cold. The symbols on the wall flared, and suddenly the room was alive. Shadows moving, the floorboards vibrating like a living thing. Invisible hands wrapped around her throat. She gasped, clutching the amulet to her chest. Through the panic, words from Claudia's story flashed in her mind. The old rites, the way the government men had silenced the spirit. The original ritual demanded acceptance, bloodline continuation. But Emily wasn't Mary. She wouldn't be a vessel. She forced the amulet against the glowing symbol carved into the wall. A shock ran through her arm. The whispering grew louder, then broke into a wail. A baby's cry, but twisted, furious. "I'm not your mother," Emily choked. "I release you. I set you free." The symbols flickered wildly, and a sudden wind slammed the door behind her. But Emily ran. Not down the stairs, but out into the night, toward the cemetery. She knew where this needed to end. The fog thickened as she reached the mound. Her breath came in white bursts. She knelt in the wet earth, placed the amulet atop the unmarked grave, and whispered the words again. No acceptance, no continuation. Only release. The crying began softly beneath the soil, swelling into a scream that shook the air around her. The ground trembled. Trees bent as if in a gale. Emily kept repeating the words, louder, until her voice broke. Then suddenly silence. The fog lifted. The air grew light for the first time since she'd arrived in Harrow's Creek. The weight that had followed her for weeks dissolved like smoke in the wind. Emily stayed on her knees, shaking, staring at the mound. Nothing moved. The night was still. In the days that followed, the town seemed different, lighter. People walked past the Whitmore property without averting their eyes. The air no longer carried that heavy, listening quiet. But at night, when Emily lay in her bed far from the mountains, sometimes she woke to a faint sound. A gurgle, a soft, wet giggle in the dark corner of her room. It never lasted long, just enough to remind her. Some stories don't end. They wait.